Alright, so before we get started, I just want to quickly share an announcement with you all. I've actually created, a GitHub repository related to this particular series. The link for that you can find in the description box down below. But basically, in that I will be sharing the resources and the notes that I'll be making, following along this particular series. So if you're interested in learning with me and hopping into this amazing journey, you can simply fork this particular repository and add in your learnings for each day, and yeah, just share the good work that you're doing in public. So that's pretty much about it, and let's jump right into the video. All right, so let us see like how basically these websites that we actually use today, how these traditionally looked like, what was the basic architecture of these particular websites. So this is like the bare minimum architecture of a particular website, as basic as it can get. There are basically three components of a particular website. One is the client. So the client are basically the users like me and like you all out there who wants to basically search something, and they'll basically send some request to that particular server or whatever they want to search. The next component is, the second number comes the server. So the server is basically used to perform like basic operations, retrieve requests from a particular client, and then the server will basically process that particular request and give it back to the client. Now these both things, in middle of these both things is what is something called as network. So a network is basically consists of cables or routers. The main work of the network is basically it acts as a bridge between the client and the server. So network's main job is to basically connect the client and the server to itself. So basically the client can send a request to the server through this network, and then the server can answer back to that particular client through this network again. Now, how does they do this? How basically a client locates the server and a server locates the client back? This is done through the use of IP addresses, right? So through IP addresses, a particular client can find that particular server, and then after the request has been processed, that server is able to send back the information to the client through the same IP address that particular server has. So basically, IP address works like an information or like an address for a client and for the server itself. Now, a server, basically consists of a few components that basically, help it to perform these certain operations that we just talked about recently. The number one is the CPU. Now the CPU, we all know what the CPU does. It helps us to perform some basic calculations and some basic operations. We all have CPUs in our laptops and our PCs. So a server basically needs CPU to perform certain operations, the to and fro, storing and retrieving of data, and certain calculations that it does, the computational calculations. The next component is the RAM, and that is basically the main memory of the server. So basically, we can quickly retrieve and store some of the information that we want to store in that particular server, and we can quickly retrieve that whenever we want. So that was the basic function of the RAM. The next is basically, storage of data. Now a storage of data, is really necessary for a particular server, because you really want a client particularly wants his data to be stored in that particular server, so he can basically retrieve it anytime. Now the storage of data was actually done in two ways. The number one was the unstructured way to store data. Now the unstructured way consisted of like storing data in particular files, the file system that we know. It is not the most efficient way to store. That is why it is considered as an unstructured way. Now there was another way to store the data, which we all know today is storing as a structured data. This is where we store data in some amount of database. So we have all these databases today. We have MongoDB, all those databases that are out there. It helps us to store a particular data in a structured manner. So we can most efficiently retrieve and store our information in those particular databases. And last but not the least was like the networking aspect of those servers. So like we talked about how the server is basically used to find the client and through that particular network using the IP address, right? So how does that server do this? This is because of these networking aspects, and basically networking aspects was usually consisted of like cables, routers, DNS server. DNS means domain name system. This is how the client was able to find the server, and the server was actually able to find the client through going through that particular network, like we looked at the diagram before. These were, some of the main components that a server consisted of. Now, as we are, talking about like how the things were done traditionally, right? So the approaches that were followed previously. So in that times, the servers that we just talked about now. These were actually physical bodies, and by physical bodies, I mean, you would have seen those big machines, and a lot of cables wound around them. Those were actually a server that was set up by a particular company, who wants to basically use them with their applications. Now these servers, as they were physical form, they would actually, be needing a place for storage, right? So, you would be needing a lot of servers if your application is really big and your organization is big. So that particular place to store a lot of servers was known as the data center. By the name it already suggests, data and center. So a center where all the particular servers were basically placed and maintained, that was actually called as a data center. And these were like basically maintained by that particular organization, or if you were like a personal user, you would have to set up all this in your basically like garage or your house. Now we all are familiar with the company Apple, right? We all use its product right now, but how actually Apple came into being? We all know like Steve Jobs actually created the first Apple computer Macintosh in his garage, right? So he would had basically set up that particular server, the physical machine that we just talked about, in his garage in order to be able to utilize all those computational services. So this is like a really good example that shows us like how actually things were done in those times, and how you would be needing a lot of hardware to set up something and create a basic application. Now although this approach was basically being followed by a lot of companies out there and a lot of organizations, but they actually face a lot of issues and problems while following this particular approach. So the first one is paying for rent, and obviously you are actually setting up physical servers and taking up a lot of space, building up more and more data centers. You'll actually be needing to pay rent for those spaces, right? A lot of cost from the company actually used to go in paying rents for these particular big spaces. Now the next one is power supply, and this is again one of the most major issues that the companies had. So you are setting these large machines, and you are setting these large data centers, right? So they'll actually be needing constant power supply for actually functioning properly. So a lot of cost of the organizations and the companies was actually used to go to the power supply part, to maintain a strong and a constant power supply for the operations to go smoothly, right? Now this was actually not a very good approach if we look at it in a scaling point of view, basically, because for more scaling, setting up more servers or setting up more data centers, we would need to pay more rent, we would need to pay for more power supply, and then the cost of production would definitely increase a lot. So for the larger organizations out there, this can definitely work, but there were actually a lot of small organizations out there that couldn't afford that much amount of money spending just on paying for rent and the power supply. So if we see in general, there was actually only limited scaling available in this particular approach. Now most definitely you have set up this big powerhouses, and the whole lot of servers in there, so you'll definitely be needing 24/7 maintenance time for those, right? Because you don't want anything to go wrong. Like in this scenario, everything was connected, each and every server was connected with each other, and if something goes wrong, even even a single thing goes wrong in a particular server, then the work could get affected. The production of other servers and the operations of other servers could get affected. So the 24 hours of maintenance time was always needed for basically to correct the mistakes as quickly as possible. Now the last but not the least point was what if a disaster occur, as everything is in a physical form. So whatever calamity occurs, now who will be responsible for that particular time, right? Yeah, these were some of the major problems that the organizations and then company faced by following the traditional approach of the physical servers and actually setting up the data centers at various places. Now the one-stop solution to all those major problems that we just discussed right now was the discovery of the cloud. And after this, things became a little bit more interesting. Now the basic principle of cloud computing is, which is what is called as on-demand delivery. Now by on-demand delivery, what I mean is that, for example, you are a particular organization, right, and you are actually in need of some services. So for example, database storage, compute services, you need a deployment platform. So these are some of the services that you are in need of, right? What exactly on demand delivery means, and actually there is a particular line, which I remember, which is called as you get it when you need it. So this is like self-explanatory line, right? So if you are an organization that are in need of these services, you can get those services from leveraging some of the platforms that are out there, which are called as cloud providers. And you can get these particular services when you are in need of them. That means on demand you can get those services out of those cloud providers. So how does this work? Basically, how actually can we retrieve these particular services? There are actually certain platforms which are basically known as cloud providers, and these cloud providers basically allow us to rent those services from that particular platform. The basic principle of those cloud providers is that pay as you go. So by pay as you go, I mean, basically you only have to pay for the services that you are basically, renting from those particular cloud platforms. And whenever the demand for those services is finished, and whenever you have, done your work with those particular services, stop your payment and you can, utilize that particular amount of money in other services, right? So this is like, the basic principle of how cloud provider platforms actually work, and what is like the main basic principle of cloud computing. Now what exactly cloud computing did was basically it actually gave a little bit more power and control over the hands of these particular organizations were in a better position now to judge like what amount of compute power they needed, which would match according to their particular use cases. And again, this was actually a much simpler way to access the resources. So for example, at any given point of time, if like a particular company needed to set up a server, they were actually able to set it so quickly that because accessing these particular resources was really easy now. And these were actually some of the things that the cloud computing actually brought with itself. Now things have actually evolved if we talk about like from the basic IT practices that we used to follow previously. For example, if basically you are a user or an organization, if you want to actually set up your servers, you can directly host them on a particular cloud platform, and you don't need to worry about things like paying for rent or power supply. The cloud technically acts like a data center because it can host a lot of servers, but the most important thing to note is it's not your data center, right? It's actually hosted some other platform, and you actually don't need to worry of the things like like I mentioned, paying your rent or the power supply or 24/7 maintenance time. All this is done inside the cloud, and you can basically scale up your applications as much as you want by basically setting as much servers as you want. So that's up to you all. To be honest, there are actually a lot of real life examples that are out there which basically leverages some of these cloud platforms. So for example, we have Gmail, which is built on the Google Cloud platform. Then we have Dropbox, which is actually used for file transfers and application transfers. It was basically originally built on Amazon Web Services, so the AWS cloud, and one of the most popular streaming platforms out there, which is Netflix. This was also originally built on AWS. So yeah, these are some of the examples out there, and you can definitely see the power of cloud and how like leveraging these cloud services we can create something really unique. If you are aware of any other applications which might be using some cloud services out there, so basically you can comment those in the section down below and we can have a discussion there. So there are basically a few types of clouds that are out there, right? And these are collectively called as the deployment models of the cloud. The first one is the private cloud, and by the name suggests, this type of cloud is basically owned by a single organization, single private organization, and these are basically not exposed to public. So in that, you have a little bit more security, and there are like some sensitive information that you want to store. So you will be using private cloud in that particular case. Now we have like the public cloud, right? And this is like one of the most famous ones and which has the most use cases out there. In public cloud, what happens is that the resources are actually owned by a third-party cloud providers. For example, AWS, we have Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform. So all these resources are basically, hosted by these particular cloud platforms, and we can, as a user or as an organization, we can access those resources anytime we want, as they are exposed to public, as they are over the internet, so we can access them anytime. Remember the principle: when you need it, you get it. That's where public cloud comes. This is on demand delivery. That means whenever you'll need it, you'll get the amount of services that you need. So this is the public cloud. Last but not the least is what is called as the hybrid cloud. And by the name suggests, hybrid would mean that it consists of both private and public. We will basically have our own infrastructure. That means we have more control over the sensitive information that we want. Plus we also have some additional benefits of the public cloud. We can basically access some of the additional cloud services that are hosted on public cloud platforms, that is AWS, Azure and GCP, and many more out there. But also we have control over the sensitive information that we want, that is our own infrastructure. So that is what is called as the hybrid cloud. So these are basically the deployment models of the cloud, and it is really important for you to remember these, as they may be helpful in the future topics. Now let us look at some of the main characteristics of the cloud. So first one is like on demand, and this is the word that I've been saying throughout this whole video. But basically it's like self-service, right? You are leveraging these cloud platforms, and whenever you need a particular service, you can just request that particular cloud platform and you'll get that on demand, right? And you can get that as quickly as possible. So that's basically on demand. Whatever you need, you will get it when you demand it from a particular cloud provider. The second one is broad network access. So as the cloud basically is spread across the whole internet, you are able to access a lot of services just by sitting at a single place, right? So that is basically a broad network access. The third one is called as multi-tenancy. Now by multi-tenancy, what I mean is that multiple users can access your infrastructure or your application at the same amount of time without worrying about the security or the privacy of your application, or basically without worrying about like the crashing or having any disruptions in your work. This is what is called as multi-tenancy, and this is one of the characteristic, or we can also say one of the advantages of using the cloud. The next one, and one of the most important one, is the rapid elasticity and scalability. Now what I mean by elasticity and scalability is that as these services are on demand, that means whichever services you want, you will only get those, and not less and not more. Whenever you need a particular service to basically scale up your application, you can get those quickly, and whenever you don't need that particular services, you have used that, you can basically dispose those services as quickly as things can get. Basically that is called as elasticity and scalability. You can scale up your applications as quickly, and you can scale down your applications as quickly as possible. So that is again one of the characteristics of using the cloud. Now the last but not the least is called as the measured services. Now by measured services, I mean each and every service that you are leveraging from these cloud platforms, their usages are measured. That means you'll only pay for those services that you are taking from these platforms, and as you have completed the usage of a particular service, you can dispose of that particular service anytime you want, and the payment would stop. That means everything is measured and the usage is measured. So these were some of the main characteristics of the cloud that you should be aware of. Now let us look at the 6 advantages of the cloud, and do note that this is one of the most important topics if we talk about in the basics of cloud computing, because these are some of the things that you definitely need to remember as we go on through the series. And if you are learning about the cloud, these are some of the points that you should definitely remember as you go on ahead. Now the first one is what is known as trade capital expense, or capex for operation expense. Now what we mean by trade capital expense, actually it means like whatever things the owner owns. For example, in a particular case, like the organization or a user, whatever we own, like our own infrastructure, our own hardware, anything that the user own is called as the capital expense. And what exactly we mean by the operation expense is the cost of basically performing some functions on those particular hardware or those particular things that the owner owns. So in this case, basically these both things are reduced, right? And why? Because we are just renting the services from a third party cloud provider, for example AWS. We are not actually investing on any more hardware or any extra things. We are only paying for the services that we need from these particular platforms. We are only paying for the rent of these particular services. So overall the trade capital expense and the operation expense would be reduced. Now the second point is economic benefits. Now most definitely we'll be getting economic benefits, right? Because the cloud providers like AWS or any other cloud provider are actually being used by a lot of organizations and at a really large scale. So the prices of the services that are offered are really affordable, and which all in all makes it more reachable to the worldwide. That means we'll be getting a lot of economic benefits when we'll be using these particular cloud services. Now the third point is stop the guessing game, and by stop the guessing game I mean the cloud basically extracted this confusion from these organizations. The questions like, okay, how much compute power I would need, how much database storage I would need, all these questions were answered by the cloud, because each and every services that you use from these cloud providers is measured. That means you don't have to guess whatever services that you will be using. You'll get an exact measurement of whatever you are using, and you only pay for whatever you are using. I think that's a really good benefit of using the cloud services. Increase speed and agility. Now what we mean by that is, we previously discussed as well, as all the services on the cloud providers are on demand. That means whatever you will be needing, you'll only get that. So that means you can create and basically do stuff right away and as quickly as possible. You can basically scale up your applications as quickly as possible, and you can scale down however you need, right? So this is basically the cloud actually increased the speed and agility of a particular organization to function. Now the fifth and one of the most amazing advantages of the cloud according to me is the organizations or the companies who are actually using these services, they don't have to worry about running and maintaining these particular infrastructure. So for example, if they have created a particular application, they just go to the cloud platform, just rent some of the services, and just leave it that way, and everything is maintained and run by the cloud provider that you are using. I think that's a really amazing advantage of using the cloud, and it actually saves a lot of time for some of the big organizations that are out there. Now, last but not the least is the global infrastructure of the cloud. And what do we mean by that is, for example, if you have an application that you develop locally and you want that application to go globally or scale it up at a worldwide level. So leveraging these particular services and the cloud providers, for example AWS, you can go global in minutes and basically scale your applications up to a really large level. So I think that's a really amazing advantage of using the cloud. All right, so this was actually, the basic introduction to cloud computing, in which we covered like how did we actually transition from, basic IT practices to using the cloud, and, some of the characteristics and the advantages of using that. We'll be covering, more on this particular topic in the further videos, and especially through learning about AWS. I am pretty excited and I hope you all are as well. Things are gonna get pretty amazing as we go along in this series. Do check out the link to the GitHub repository in the description box down below if you're interested in joining in this amazing journey with me. Yeah, if you liked this video, do give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, share the good work that you're doing in public. That's how we all learn and grow together, because at the end of the day, that's the main aim of this particular series as well. Again, like I am a beginner in the content creation space, so your advices and suggestions would really mean a lot to me. You can always comment down your thoughts about a particular video in the comment section down below. I'll definitely check those and try to improve with each video that I'll be posting. Awesome, that's pretty much about it from me today, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.